Hello, students. This is Mr. Brown, and this video is from Monday, February the 22nd. Today is a virtual asynchronous day, so there will be no live Teams meetings. Please watch this video in its entirety as we will be covering some new material and making some announcements for the week. Essentially, we're going to pick up where we had planned on last week. Today, we are going to continue our Age of Imperialism PowerPoint. Specifically, we're going to cover the remainder of the Scramble for Africa. Tomorrow, we are going to finish up the PowerPoint with American imperialism. In addition to the PowerPoint, there will be a couple video clips that we will watch. On Wednesday, we are going to wrap up the last of our new material. Specifically, we're going to talk about migration and the effects of migration as it relates to imperialism and industrialization. You will have a small amount of new notes to add into your notebook. You are going to have access to the Unit 5 and 6 study guide. This is essentially a test review that you don't have to turn in. Just look it over. That way you know what all you need to study for the test on Thursday. But the big thing that's coming up on Wednesday that is going to be due Wednesday by 11:59 p.m. is the Age of Imperialism SAQ. This is based on your notes from the PowerPoint, on your motivations of imperialism reading that you did earlier. Please use your notes and follow the instructions and do the best you can. There will be 3 questions. There is a 12-minute time limit on those questions. On Thursday, we are finally going to have the Unit 5 and 6 District Common Assessment. This is a major test grade. It's a multiple choice test, 26 questions. There will be a 30-minute time limit. Then on Friday, essentially, we're going to have a catch-up day. I realize things have been weird recently and you may feel a little overwhelmed, so I want to give you an opportunity to get caught up on any missing work or anything coming up that you may need to. On Friday by 11:59 p.m., both your historical documentary review extra credit essay and notebook check number 2 are going to be due. If you have not especially gotten done with everything from the notebook check, I would highly advise you get that done during class on Friday, as it is not only a daily grade, but it is 1/2 of a major grade. So let's get back to the PowerPoint. We're not going to get through a whole lot today, but would like to finish up the Scramble for Africa. Again, we've been talking about imperialism, how primarily European countries, industrialized countries, were going worldwide and conquering and colonizing new lands for raw materials and cheap labor and nationalistic motivations and new places to sell their products, just to name a few. While almost every corner of the world was affected by this in some way, shape, or form, nowhere was as wholly taken over as the continent of Africa. By the time we get to the early 20th century, Africa has been almost entirely conquered and colonized. And while the treatment of African peoples was different depending on the region and the European power that took over, sometimes treatment of Africans could be very, very bad. Probably the most noteworthy example of sheer evil and exploitation that we can discuss is that of the Belgian Congo. Belgium in the early 20th century was a relatively new country, along with other countries like Italy and Germany. Nationalism swept through Europe for years up to this point, and Belgium was one of the many new countries that were created as a result. Now, Belgium being a newer country, a less powerful country, didn't get a whole lot of Africa. We had talked about the Berlin Conference, where European countries met together to decide who would get what. Obviously, countries like Britain and France, older, wealthier, more established countries, got the majority of the territory. Whereas your younger countries like Italy and Germany, Belgium included, got less. Your fading powers like Portugal and Spain got less as well. The territory that Belgium possessed was rather large, being here in Central Africa, But considering this territory was almost entirely jungle, many of the other European nations felt it would be difficult to colonize. It would be difficult to control. The leader of Belgium, King Leopold II, appealed to leaders at the Berlin Conference to let him attempt this feat. He made a lot of lofty promises. He talked about his desire to bring Christianity to the African people, to help them build up and become more civilized. Really, his motivation was greed. King Leopold II was one of the most evil men who ever lived. By 1875, Western European nations were poised to enter the interior of Africa. King Leopold II of Belgium, who ruled from 1865 to 1909, oversaw the invasion and pacification of the Congo in Central Africa. Unlike other European rulers, Leopold owned the colony personally, the Congo Free State. This meant that he kept all the profits from the colony, which totaled nearly 1 billion. Although the term slavery was not used commonly to describe imperial activities, conditions were brutal for the laborers who harvested primarily ivory and rubber. Villages were burned down to terrorize the Congolese. Women and children were held captive to force men to work. Unproductive workers' hands were cut off to scare others into submission. Workers who did not meet their quotas were beaten, murdered, or worked to death. Laborers were essentially enslaved and forced to do back-breaking labor. Overall, conservatively, anywhere from 3 to 8 million Congolese died under King Leopold's reign of terror. Approximately 50% of the native population died under King Leopold's rule. Some of the images you're going to see are disturbing, so I warn you. This one speaks to the ideas of white man's burden, of European privilege, of a European sense of superiority, as these two Congolese men carry around this European Belgian colonist. It's really in the next picture, though, that you see things that are truly frightening. On the left, we see women and children whose hands have been hacked off, likely to scare the male members of these families into working longer and harder hours. In the upper right-hand corner, we see young men and children apparently being starved to death. In the lower right-hand corner, we see two Congolese men who likely were employed by the Belgians, whipping another Congolese for some perceived crime. The Belgians, like many powerful Europeans at the time, bought into social Darwinism. They bought into white man's burden. They made themselves believe that they were culturally and racially superior to those that they were conquering and colonizing. That is how they justified the evils that they committed in the Congo. Now, if those immediate evils weren't bad enough, sometimes these colonial activities had ramifications years down the line. Europeans knew and cared little about Africa's political and social systems. And as we said, Europeans looked down on Africa's rich cultures and tried to make Africans more like Europeans. Europeans also worsened conflicts among ethnic groups. At the Berlin Conference, Europeans were splitting up land for resources, for economic gain. They didn't care about the people that lived there, the tribes that had historically been allies, the groups that historically had hated one another. So they separated families. They forced groups together into territories that had long-standing conflict. And this just made things worse. One example is in the Belgian colony of Rwanda, where the two main ethnic groups were the Hutu and the Tutsi. The Belgians gave the Tutsi minority the best jobs and access to education so that they could act as an extension of Belgian rule over the Hutu, the ethnic majority. The historical animosity that resulted eventually led to the Rwandan genocide in 1994. Many modern problems between groups in Africa today started with their differing treatment by Europeans during the scramble for Africa. The Rwandan genocide, one of the 20th century's many genocides or purposeful attempted annihilations of another population. Some of the conflict between the Hutu and the Tutsi goes right back to how they were treated by the Belgians. Now, even though Rwanda would gain its independence in the 1960s, I believe, years later, that animosity that was created by the Belgians persisted. And the end result, in a little over 3 months, 800,000 people were killed. We'll speak more of the concept of genocide. It's something, unfortunately, as our power to kill one another has increased, it seems to happen more and more commonly, especially during the 20th century. As you can see, estimated genocides from 1900 to 2005, they are widespread. We'll talk about some of them specifically in Germany during the Holocaust, in the Soviet Union under the rule of Joseph Stalin, in China under the rule of Mao Zedong. But many of them have unfortunately happened in Africa. So looking at this map, you can kind of see the dates of African independence. First question reads, how many African nations were independent by 1949? Not many. Here I count only 4. What global conflict may have prompted European nations to grant independence to their colonies? Well, you see really the start of this wave of independence in 1949, and it just continued on into the 50s and in the 60s, even into the 80s. But if you look at the massive global conflict that was wrapping up in the 1940s, 1945 specifically, it was World War II. As we've said, World War I, but especially World War II is what led to the decolonization of most territories around the globe. We'll talk about the how and why of that a little bit later, but World War II has far-reaching implications, many of which we still feel to this day, even though we may not realize it. In what years did the majority of African nations gain independence? I think if you look at the light blue territories, mainly the 1960s, although some territories as recently as the 1980s. The moral of the story is many African nations are relatively young as far as self-government is concerned. And it says here, what kinds of problems have many African nations faced since independence? Kind of depends on what nation we're talking about. But if we were to look at Africa as a whole, we look at poverty, we look at a lack of health care, we look at the spread of disease, we look at a lack of manufacturing and modernization, many areas without improved water sources. We look at the fact that after many of these countries gained independence, corrupt governments were established, dictatorships persisted, civil war followed. Again, Africa as a continent has problems. Some nations are doing well, others are not. And while we can't place all the blame on the ramifications of European imperialism, certainly there is some blame there. So let's look at the historical impact of imperialism in Africa. There were some positive effects. European medicine and improved nutrition led to increased population and lifespan of Africans. Europeans introduced modern transportation and communication technology to Africa. A small minority of Africans received improved education and greater economic opportunities. However, there were many negative effects. Many Africans were robbed of traditional culture and social relationships. Africans in general were treated as inferior to Europeans. We've talked about the racism and discrimination associated with imperialism before. African workers were often exploited and killed. European created borders and unequal treatment led to worsening ethnic conflicts. And there were few highly educated or skilled Africans left. Many in Africa were unprepared for self-rule once colonization ended, and rampant corruption and dictatorship often followed. Tomorrow, we will close out our topic of imperialism by focusing on our own American participation in it. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day.